What's up, guys? I'm about to take a trip.
So, do I believe in time travel? No. But let's talk about today's watches that owe a lot to the past. Let's talk about watches with great historical importance. I might have just seen my great-great-great-grandfather. So I feel most of us are already aware of the historical achievements of both Rolex and Omega because of their marketing. But I also don't want to assume that everyone is. So I want to touch on that before talking about watches that I think are just as historically important. Let's talk about Rolex and their Oyster Perpetual, which in 1953 accompanied Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay on their expedition to be the first climbers to reach the top of Mount Everest. And I always thought that these watches were gifted to them, but it turns out that they were prototypes by Rolex, which would eventually evolve into the Explorer 1. And as far as Omega goes, it's their Speedmaster Man on the Moon. And this was the first watch worn on the moon by Buzz Aldrin. But as important as this watch is historically, I feel no other watch in the world has milked an achievement the way Omega has. Alright, now let's talk about other watches of great historical importance. And we're going to have to turn back the clock to 1969. And we're talking about Seiko's Astron. And this is the very watch that is responsible for the term quartz crisis, because it was the very first quartz watch sold publicly. And while the Swiss had their own quartz prototypes, they weren't released yet. In fact, this Seiko Astron is responsible for turning the Swiss industry upside down, as they were in panic mode trying to come up with their own quartz version. And at that time, a lot of us were tired of the mechanical movement and the repair costs and the replacements of that. We were looking for something innovative, something that was so cheap and easy to switch out like a battery. But the Swiss watches weren't the only watches that were affected by the Seiko's Astron. In fact, Seiko's own watches, the King Seiko and the Lord Seiko, were also affected. Those were mechanical watches and were put out to pasture. Thank goodness Grand Seiko survived. And the Seiko Astron has evolved from this to this and still going strongly. And even though Seiko's Astron has put a lot of mechanical watches out of business, Audemars Piguet went the opposite direction with their Royal Oak in 1972. And it was the first steel sports luxury watch and the most expensive one. It cost $3,300 in 1972, which is about $19,800 in today's prices. It was more expensive than a gold Patek and 10 times more expensive than a Rolex Submariner. However, it was not an overnight success, as it faced a lot of criticism for its crazy high price, its integrated bracelet, its disruptive design with its open gasket and screws. But it was, as the designer of this watch, Gerald Genta, would describe, as his best design. It's a timeless classic that has survived the quartz crisis.
I want my MTV. Alright.
It was around the time of the birth of I Want My MTV that the Swiss industry was looking for a less expensive, reliable watch that they could sell in large numbers. Enter Swatch in 1983. This fit the bill. This was ironically an important watch that the modern luxury watchmakers owed a lot to. And here is my Swatch. This Swatch, I remember these were about $35 at the time, while their most expensive Swatch was the all black one with diamonds, and that was going for like $99. The Swatch is still going strong today. This is a very fun, colorful watch with this rubber protective guard. This is basically useless. It's just a colorful rubber band, but these watches were all the rage during the 80s, and I'm glad I still have mine. I wonder if this is worth anything in today's dollars. But the Swatch is another fun and historically relevant watch that really sold a lot of watches for the Swiss. Another important historical watch that is just a bit more expensive than Swatch is Breguet. And we're talking there in 1969. And it's important because it is the first tourbillon ever invented by Abraham Breguet. And while a lot of watch manufacturers, if not obligatory or essential, claim to have a tourbillon in their collection. This is it's a beautiful watch. It's a stunning looking watch. It's meant to have been very accurate, although, dare I say it,
Do it.
it's not necessary to be an accurate watch by today's standards. It is a gorgeous work of art, and it seems it is important for a watch manufacturer to be taken seriously to have a tourbillon in its collection. So it is very relevant even in the cachet standards or the prestige standards of today's watches, although not mandatory or necessary to have an accurate watch. I am probably going to have to refer to my notes for this watch, and that's the Zenith El Primero chronograph. This is a bit of a sticky situation as it was released in 1969 as the first self-winding chronograph. However, Breitling, Heuer, and Seiko also released their version of the self-winding chronograph in the same year. So while which one came out first is still not settled, what is without argument is that El Primero was the first full rotor high beat chronograph with a self-winding movement. The winding rotor was the full diameter of the movement versus a micro rotor movement by Breitling, Heuer, and Seiko. The El Primero was capable of measuring time intervals as short as 1/10 of a second, a first for a mechanical watch, and one of my favorite looking chronographs. Now let's talk about the Casio G-Shock, and this is not a watch we find on the lips of die-hard mechanical watch enthusiasts, but this is a game changer and a real groundbreaking watch. The G-Shock was invented by Kiko Ibe, a Casio engineer, because he was frustrated with how fragile mechanical and quartz watches were. So his goal was simple, to come up with a watch that could survive a 10-meter drop, have 100 meters of water resistance, and have a battery life of 10 years. Simple, right? But not back in 1983, as the DW5000 was born, and it went through over 200 prototypes before succeeding. And famously, it was the only prototype, or the first prototype, to survive a drop from the 4th floor window of a men's bathroom. And today, we still depend and rely on the G-Shock. It is a watch that never seems to let us down, even under the harshest of conditions. And more importantly, it is a favorite among servicemen and women whose lives depend on them. So speaking of saving lives, let's talk about the Breitling emergency watch. And this watch packed a distress signal which could be picked up anywhere within 90 miles. And it was credited in helping the rescue of 2 British pilots after their helicopter crashed in 2003 in Antarctica. And then in 2013, the Emergency 2 was launched for about $12,000. Is that expensive? Yes, but I'm sure those 2 British pilots would agree that it's worth it. Okay, let's finish with the smartwatch and not necessarily the Apple Watch, although I feel a lot of people credit the Apple Watch for being the original or first smartwatch, when in fact it is a latecomer to the game. The Apple Watch didn't come out till 2015, long after other smartwatches, and at that time it was known as the iWatch. But because the Apple Watch is so popular, you know what this also reminds me of? Xerox, for example. Xerox is a brand, but when we ask for a photocopy to be made or refer to a photocopy, we simply say, hey, can I get a Xerox of that? We're not asking for a Xerox, we're asking for a copy, but it's so synonymous with the Xerox name. Xerox and copy go together. A lot like Kleenex. Kleenex is a name brand, but when we refer to a tissue, we don't say, can I have a tissue? We say, can I have a Kleenex? Okay, end of rant. So the first smartwatch, and we're going to have to go way back in time, a lot further back than I think a lot of us might guess. We're going to have to go back to 1927 for the +4 wristlet route indicator. And I think this is a great looking watch, even by today's standard. It just seems that it was so ahead of its time. And while there is no GPS built into this beauty from the 1920s, it would still get us from point A to B. Simply slot in the scroll map cartridge for your set route and away you go. And at least you didn't have to charge this watch every night. The next, quote, smartwatch didn't come again until 1972 by Hamilton, and it was the first all-electric digital watch. And it came in 18 karat gold, and it boasted LEDs, and you had to push a button to tell the time. And I think this is a really cool watch, and if we can find one for $2,000, I think we should grab one simply because of the 18 karat gold. So if we can find a solid gold watch for $2,000 or less, that would be a smart steal. Let's talk about a couple of more smartwatches, and let's fast forward to 1982 for the Seiko TV watch. And this was the same watch worn by James Bond in Octopussy. And we needed a receiver and an adapter just to watch grainy footage and not color footage. It was only presented in 10 shades of gray. Let's get our minds out of the gutter. No, I'm not talking about that movie. I'm talking about the quality of the TV footage. And we could also get this watch for about $600. And finally, let's talk about the Seiko Data 2000 from 1983. Here, we could store memos, add calendar entries, and it would act as a calculator. But we would also have to make use of the clip-on keyboard, which by today's standards would make us really hip and cool, as some of us have probably seen people using the old-fashioned electric typewriters in coffee shops instead of laptops and iPads. There were a whole host of Android devices that were the first smartwatches long before the Apple Watch. But I do have to give credit to the Apple Watch for making a really good and effective smartwatch that pairs really well with their Apple products, better than any other pairings of other Android devices. So we have to give them credit where credit is due. There is one common theme here, and that's all of these historically important watches are still going strongly today. So while trends come and go, true watches are always here to stay. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you the next time. So other than Rolex and... So what are some historical snorkels? Mount Everest was climbed by Mount Everest was scaled by... No. So, the smartwatch. And we're talking